What happens when you take the highest paid voice in sports journalism, a man who has built an empire on the sheer decibel level of his convictions, and place him in the center of a political echo chamber that has lost the ability to hear anything but its own applause? What happens when the straight shooter walks into a room designed for crooked narratives? You are about to witness a collision that is less like a political debate and more like a controlled demolition of a condemned building. This is not just Stephen A. Smith visiting The View. This is reality checking into a hotel that has been booked solid by delusion for the last decade. In the vast, polarized landscape of American media, there are two types of predators. There are the pack hunters, like the women of The View, who rely on consensus, applause signs, and the safety of numbers to maul their ideological opponents. And then there is the lone wolf, the apex predator of hot takes, Stephen A. Smith. He is a man who can turn a discussion about a point guard's ankle injury into a Shakespearean monologue about betrayal. He speaks in headlines and breathes in viral clips. When ABC called him down from his throne at ESPN to sit at the table across the hall, they thought they were bringing in a colleague. They thought they were bringing in a neighbor. They forgot that Stephen A. Smith doesn't have neighbors. He has audiences. The premise was simple. Assess the State of the Union 1 year into Donald Trump's second term. The hosts, still reeling from the shock of an election they were promised they would win, looked at Stephen A. as a potential ally, a fellow media elite who would commiserate with their despair. But what they failed to realize is that Stephen A. Smith does not deal in despair. He deals in scoreboards. And when he looked at the scoreboard of American politics, he didn't see a tragedy. He saw a blowout. He saw a team that got outplayed, outcoached, and outworked. And he was about to tell the losing team exactly why they were sitting on the bench. The geography of the confrontation was deceptively intimate. Stephen A. Smith didn't have to travel far to enter the lion's den. He simply had to cross the hallway. "I sit right across the hall," he announced as he settled into the chair, adjusting his suit with the swagger of a man who knows he is the most valuable asset in the building. "That's right. It is nice to have you as a neighbor," one host chirped, establishing a veneer of corporate camaraderie. The atmosphere was light, almost festive. The audience cheered, unaware that they were cheering for the man who was about to dismantle their worldview. The hosts smiled, their questions wrapped in the soft cotton of morning talk show banter. They treated him like a visiting dignitary from the world of sports, a fun distraction before they got down to the serious business of bashing the president. "So, it's been a minute since you were here," one host began, setting the stage. "Last time you were here, it was 6 weeks into Trump, too. How are you feeling now, a year into Trump?" It was the trap of civility. They expected him to sigh. They expected him to shake his head and say, "Oh, it's been a nightmare, hasn't it?" They offered him a comfortable seat on their bandwagon of misery. But Stephen A. sat there sharp-eyed and unblinking. He didn't look like a man suffering under a regime. He looked like a man analyzing a game tape. He looked at the hosts, not with malice, but with the frustration of a coach watching his players miss wide-open layups. They asked him about the affordability crisis, about Trump calling Democratic concerns a scam. They wanted him to be outraged by the rhetoric. "Well, that's rhetoric on his part," Stephen A. said, his voice calm, dismissing the bait with a wave of his hand. "There's nothing surprising or unpredictable about that. You could see it coming from a mile away." He wasn't biting. He wasn't outraged. He was analytical. The hosts shifted slightly in their seats. This wasn't the script. He was supposed to be angry, not analyzing Trump's strategy like it was a defensive scheme by Bill Belichick. The trap was set, but the prey wasn't walking into it. Stephen A. was walking around it, inspecting the mechanism and preparing to kick it over. The calm setup was merely the deep breath before the rant. The neighbor from across the hall had brought his own playbook. And it didn't include nodding along politely. The shift happened when the conversation turned to the Democrats. The hosts, secure in their bubble, assumed that the blame for the current political reality lay solely at the feet of the voters. Misinformation or Trump himself. Stephen A. leaned forward, ESPN mode engaged. The voice that had silenced screaming co-hosts for decades began to rise, not in volume, but in intensity. But in the end, the Democrats give credit where credit is due, he began. A prelude that sounded like a compliment but felt like a warning shot. He started listing the failures. Losses in New York, New Jersey, Virginia. He rattled off the names of political battlegrounds like they were stats from a box score. Clearly, there's something going on within the Democratic establishment that's saying, "Let's focus on real issues that are pertinent to the American people," he said, his voice tightening. And then he delivered the verdict. The trigger was pulled. "I thought they handed him the election as opposed to him actually winning it," Stephen A. declared. The air left the room. To say this on The View, the spiritual home of the resistance, was heresy. He wasn't saying Trump stole it. He wasn't saying the voters were tricked. Asterisk, he was saying the Democrats choked. He was saying they were the Atlanta Falcons in the Super Bowl, and Trump was Tom Brady just waiting for them to collapse. Now they were forcing him to play ball and figure out a way to beat them because they were coming. He continued, but the damage was done. The host scrambled. Joy Behar, the goalkeeper of the liberal narrative, tried to deflect. The Republicans were not favored to win any of these. The Republicans were basically trying to steal a few seats. She stammered, attempting to reframe the blowout as a statistical anomaly. Did anybody expect a Republican to win the New York City mayoral race? Stephen A. looked at her with the expression of a man watching someone try to argue that the sky is green. He didn't need to shout yet. He just needed to let the facts hang in the air. New York City is probably the most liberal area in the entire country. They're going to have to suffer the consequences of their actions in the voting booth. And only then will they realize they made a mistake. The tension in the studio was palpable. Stephen A. wasn't just analyzing politics. He was exposing their failure. He was telling them that their strategy of moral superiority had backfired. He was telling them that while they were obsessing over tone and tweets, the other side was winning on the ground. The hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't going well. They needed to change the subject. They needed a gotcha. They needed something that would force Stephen A. back into the fold. Something that would make him condemn Trump unequivocally. They reached for Jeffrey Epstein. If they couldn't win on policy, they would win on scandal. They pulled out the creepiest weapon they had. Convinced this finally would be the trap Stephen A. Smith couldn't talk his way out of. Little did they know, they were bringing a knife to a nuclear war. The pleasantries were over. The neighborly visit had curdled into a confrontation. Having failed to corner Stephen A. on the battlefield of electoral strategy, the hosts reached for the darker ammunition. They pivoted to the moral abyss. Convinced that here, in the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein's island, even the loudest defender of pragmatism would be forced to kneel. House Oversight Democrats released this trove of really creepy photos from inside Jeffrey Epstein's private island. The host began, her voice dropping to a register of solemn disgust. It was the ultimate trap. If Stephen A. defended Trump, he would be defending the indefensible. If he attacked Trump, he would validate their entire narrative. What do you think the Trump administration will actually and ultimately release? And if they have nothing to hide, why did they fight so forcefully against this? She challenged, locking eyes with him. The studio held its breath. This was the gotcha. But Stephen A. Smith operates by a different set of rules. He didn't flinch. He didn't offer a blind defense. Instead, he offered a cold, hard calculation. "Well, I'm suspicious," he admitted. disarming them with agreement before pivoting to the counterattack. But I also believe that there are people that have seen the Epstein files. And if there was something directly incriminating about Trump, we would have found out about it before the election, because every measure would have been exhausted to make sure he didn't return to the White House. It was a devastating application of logic over emotion. He was telling them that their resistance was so thorough, so desperate, that if a smoking gun existed, they would have fired it by now. He wasn't defending Trump's character. He was insulting their competence. He leaned in, broadening the indictment. I do believe, however, when you have power brokers in place on both sides of the aisle, they protect each other. The hosts bristled. They didn't want a lecture on bipartisan corruption. They wanted a specific condemnation. They pressed him on Trump's friendship with Epstein. But Stephen A. cut through the noise with a moral absolute that rendered their partisan bickering irrelevant. I don't care when it was, he boomed, his voice rising. If you're that kind of despicable human being, I want to find out. I don't give a damn if it was 20 years ago, 40 years ago. He neutralized the trap by agreeing with the pursuit of truth, but refusing to use it as a partisan bludgeon. You want to see the files? The host asked, hoping for a no. Of course, I want to see files. Absolutely. Frustrated, the antagonists shifted tactics. If they couldn't paint Trump as a criminal, they would paint him as an invalid. They brought up the cognitive test. They listed the late-night rants, the name-calling, the alleged sleeping in meetings. He's texting and texting, attacking female reporters as pig, piggy, and ugly. He's falling asleep in the middle of a meeting, the host recounted, listing the sins like a prosecutor reading charges. So what do you think's going on with him? They waited for the diagnosis. They waited for Stephen A. to admit that the president was unfit. Trump is being Trump. Stephen A. replied with a shrug that suggested the question itself was a waste of time. What? Oh, really? There's nothing cognitively wrong there. The host pushed, incredulous, and then Stephen A. dropped the hammer. He exposed the fatal flaw in their entire obsession with Trump's behavior. Well, I'm not saying whether there is or isn't, he clarified, refusing to play doctor. What I'm saying is 77 million people don't care. They voted for him. The silence in the room was deafening. He had just told them that their outrage, their shock, their endless analysis of Trump's tweetsit didn't matter. It was noise. Despite the onslaught coming his way, he knocked off folks one by one. Stephen A. reminded them, turning the knife, and the Democrats let him because they weren't on their game. He was dismantling their reality brick by brick. They wanted to talk about Trump's sleep schedule. He wanted to talk about the scoreboard. They were playing checkers. He was playing 4D chess. The hosts were losing control. The personal attacks had failed. The moral traps had been sidestepped. Stephen A. Smith was sitting in their chair on their show, telling their audience that the Democrats had handed the election to a man they despised. They needed a new angle. They needed to move to ground where they felt morally superior. The military? The conversation shifted to Senator Mark Kelly and a video, reminding troops they can refuse illegal orders. This was sacred ground for the hosts. Surely Stephen A. wouldn't dare attack a veteran and an astronaut. My friend. I want to talk to you about some things that you recently said, the host began, her tone hardening. You recently accused Senator Mark Kelly, a veteran, an astronaut, of crossing the line. They played the clip. They read his quotes back to him. They were setting him up for the walk of shame. They expected him to apologize, to say he misspoke, to bow down to the credentials of Senator Kelly. I'd love to give you the opportunity to perhaps change your position on what you said. The host offered. A poisoned olive branch. The air in the studio grew heavy. This was the moment of submission. This was where the guest usually folds. But Stephen A. Smith does not fold. He doubled down. "I'm not changing a thing," he fired back, his voice slicing through the studio like a razor. I didn't stutter once. The explosion had begun. They had tried to corner him with patriotism, and instead, they had unleashed the full force of his conviction. He wasn't just refusing to apologize. He was preparing to go to war over the very definition of duty. The studio air crackled with the static, electricity of a confrontation that had gone off script. The host, realizing that her polite invitation for him to change his position had been swatted away like a weak jump shot, decided to abandon civility. She reached for the ultimate weapon in the talk show host's arsenal: condescension. "You want to say loud and wrong," she sneered. A phrase designed to reduce his passionate argument to mere noise. It was a label meant to delegitimize him, to paint him as the angry man shouting at clouds while the adults in the room shook their heads. But attempting to shame Stephen A. Smith for being loud is like trying to shame a shark for being wet. It is his natural state. It is the source of his power. Well, you could call it loud and wrong all you want to. Stephen A. fired back, leaning into the microphone, his voice filling every corner of the room. "You're entitled to your opinion. I'm entitled to mine." It wasn't just defending a statement. He was defending the very concept of independent thought. The host tried to bury him under the weight of credentials, citing Pete Heggs and military codes. Pete Heggs said, "I do think there have to be consequences for abject war crimes," the host lectured, trying to use a conservative voice to trap him. Stephen A. didn't take the bait. He swept the chessboard clean. "First of all, I don't give a damn what Pete Heggs has to say," he declared, refusing to be boxed in by their prepared talking points. He stripped the argument down to its rawest nerve: the danger of undermining the chain of command. You don't tell military men and women to ignore an order from the commander-in-chief. You don't do that, he insisted, his voice booming with the authority of a man who understands that in sports, as in war, chaos begins when the coach loses the locker room. The host scrambled to interrupt, citing the military code of conduct and unlawful orders. They were desperate to prove him factually incorrect, to pin him on a technicality. But Stephen A. revealed that he hadn't walked into this arena unprepared. He hadn't just read a teleprompter. He had done the work. "I had 2 governors. By the way, text me to tell me I was wrong," he admitted, baiting them for a split second before delivering the counterpunch. "And I had 2 senators that reached out to me and said, you weren't wrong at all." The revelation hit the table like a gavel. With that single sentence, he shattered the illusion of consensus they had tried to build. He proved that even within their own political elite, there was division. He proved that the echo chamber of Times The View did not represent the reality of the country, or even the reality of Washington. The hosts were exhausted. They had thrown policy at him, and he had cited the scoreboard. They had thrown Epstein at him, and he had demanded the truth. They had thrown moral outrage at him. He had thrown back reality. Stephen A. Smith sat there unruffled, adjusting his suit. He had survived the ambush, not by fighting on their terms, but by forcing them to fight on his. He had exposed the fundamental flaw in their strategy. They believed that if they shamed him enough, he would bend. But Stephen A. is a man who made a career out of saying things that make half the country angry, only to be proven right by the playoffs. "I'm looking at the soldiers and saying, don't get yourself in trouble. Let somebody else do it," he said, delivering his final verdict on the Mark Kelly controversy. It was a message of pragmatism over performative heroism, a language the average American understands perfectly. Even if the hosts of Times The View found it foreign, the interview wound down not with a handshake, but with a ceasefire. Stephen A. Smith gathered his things, his demeanor shifting back to the professional broadcaster. He didn't need to scream anymore. The silence of the hosts, their inability to force a concession, spoke louder than any rant. He looked at the camera one last time, the straight shooter locking eyes with the audience. He had walked into the most hostile environment on daytime television and refused to be manufactured. He refused to be a prop. He refused to be a neighbor who politely nodded while the house burned down as he exited the stage, leaving Times the View behind him. The contrast was blinding. On one side, a panel of hosts reading from a script, frantic to maintain a narrative that was crumbling in real time. On the other, a man who spoke with the organic, messy, undeniable force of conviction. What started as a routine segment on the state of the Trump presidency became a viral autopsy of Democratic failure. Stephen A. Smith didn't just silence Joy Behar. He held up a mirror to a media establishment that has forgotten how to listen. They are going to have to suffer the consequences of their actions. He had warned them, and as the credits rolled, the audience was left with a lingering question, the kind that keeps producers up at night. Was X right? Did the echo chamber go too far? Stephen A. Smith proved that in a world of manufactured outrage, the most dangerous thing a man can be is loud and wrong, especially when he turns out to be right. The hosts remained in their studio, safe in their bubble, while Stephen A. walked back across the hall. Back to the world of sports, where the score is final and the excuses don't count.